increase prices for lands of forest, and this of course relies on privatization or commodification of forests and turning them into sort of carbon sinks for the future. And so once you drive up prices for the forest, it provides an incentive, of course, for their control and ownership by, for example, corporations or even just the state. In many communities, Indigenous peoples don't have anything but customary title to the land, and so this also provides the threat that Indigenous peoples will lose their access and title to the land and not be prohibited, or will be prohibited from taking traditional roles within the forest. For example, going in there to harvest for their own spiritual, their own food, nutritional purposes, things that they've done for thousands of years, but now all of a sudden will be prohibited because it's seen as degrading the forest and devaluing the forest. So there's been a lot of concern over the way this has been done, and in particular, the World Bank doesn't have a great track record with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous groups, and enacted no consultations before they developed this plan. And so when they actually did these consultations with different groups, they weren't supported in many areas. But paragraph 37 called for the World Bank's the recommendations coming from the consultations to the World Bank to be implemented. And so in that sort of sense, it sort of sent a green light, to the World Bank that what they were doing was okay as long as they included some of these recommendations. But what was coming from a lot of our communities and a lot of people that we worked with was that the plan isn't okay, no matter how many recommendations that they include, and that the basic model and principles that they were dealing with would allow for the continued degradation of the environment. Because we're not talking about just conservation of forests, we're talking about reduced emissions from deforestation. And so what you're really talking about is providing these sort of credits on a carbon market. And so that's going to just allow northern companies to continue to pollute at the expense of paying southern countries to sort of attempt to stop deforestation, which is also very, very hard to actually quantify how much carbon credits you're actually going to generate, and hard to quantify just exactly who is doing this sort of deforestation and actually make sure that it gets down to the community level, which is what Indigenous groups have been particularly concerned about, because a lot of them have no even recognition by their governments. And so it's a real question of how Indigenous groups are not going to be anything but negatively affected by some of these plans.